All right, welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we are going way, way back in time, back to prehistory, to be exact. We're going to be digging deep into the prehistory of Arkansas
That's right.
and using what we know from archaeology and some historical accounts
Yeah.
to get a better grasp of how people first lived on this land. I think what we really want to do is get into their daily lives and see if we can trace how their cultures evolved over, well, really thousands of years,
Yeah.
up to the time when, European explorers showed up.
Exactly. We're talking about a huge span of time here, from the end of the last ice age, somewhere between 17,000 and 12,000 BC, all the way to 1500s AD.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that kind of time scale. It's just massive.
Yeah, that is.
And to help us break all that down, archaeologists have come up with these major cultural periods, which we'll be using as sort of guideposts today.
Yeah.
We'll be talking about the Paleo-Indian period, the Dalton, the Archaic, Woodland, and the Mississippian. So get ready for some really surprising stuff.
Yeah.
The adaptations that these early people made, the things they invented, and how they really connected to this land in such a deep way.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's dive in. Let's start at the very beginning with the Paleo-Indian period.
So the Paleo-Indian period, roughly from 17,000 to 8,500 BC, is really when people first arrived in North America. It's generally accepted that these Paleo-Indians, they were descendants of Ice Age hunters who came from Europe and Western Asia. They're Upper Paleolithic ancestors, and this refers to the later part of the Old Stone Age, a time when we see these huge advances in how they made tools and symbolic expression.
Wow, and they must have had quite a journey to get here.
Oh, it was incredible. The theory that's most widely accepted is that they crossed the Beringia land bridge. Between 17,000 and 12,000 BC, the climate warmed a bit, enough that they could follow herds of animals across this 1,000-mile-wide landmass that connected Siberia and Alaska.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and the land bridge was there because global sea levels were a lot lower back then. So much of the Earth's water was trapped in these massive ice sheets, although that land route actually closed around 10,000 DC as the sea level started to rise again. But there's also, increasing evidence that suggests that some really early migrations, they might have even used boats traveling along the Pacific coast.
So they basically walked, or maybe even sailed, their way into this entirely new world. I'm curious, what was it like when they got to what we now call Arkansas? I mean, how different was it back then?
Imagine a landscape totally different from what we see today. When they arrived in southeastern North America around 10,500 BC, they found what we call Pleistocene megafauna. These were the large Ice Age animal, think mammoths and mastodons, giant bison, even these creatures called paleollamas. They were kind of like a larger version of llamas that we see today.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and then there were caribou roaming around in tundra areas, and elk and smaller game living in the forests along the rivers. It was this mix of environments that we just don't see anymore, like habitats that today are separated by huge distances. Well, back then they were right next to each other.
And I bet finding food was a whole different challenge, too.
Oh, absolutely. Edible plants were pretty scarce, and most of the rivers and streams, they were probably way too cold for many fish, shellfish, or other aquatic life that they could eat. These big animals, the megafauna, they were really the main source of food and really for just about everything else they needed.
I see. So how did they survive in such a challenging environment? What kind of tools and technology did they have to work with?
Their survival, it really depended on their nomadic lifestyle, always on the move, following those big herds of animals. And they developed this very specific set of tools for that lifestyle. Like they made these amazingly refined spear points called Clovis points, using stoneworking techniques that had been passed down for generations, I'm sure.
So
Yeah, these Clovis points, they're willow leaf shaped, and they have this distinct flute, which is a channel that's been removed from the base of the point. And this made it easier to attach it securely to a bone or ivory foreshaft, almost like a socket. Then that foreshaft fit onto a longer wooden shaft, so it was like a very adaptable weapon they could use for both close-up thrusting or throwing from a distance.
Oh, that's really clever.
Yes.
And I remember reading about another tool they used that gave them even more power when they were hunting.
Right, the atlatl or throwing stick. This was a brilliant invention. Think of it as an extension of the arm. It gave them a lot more leverage, so they could throw a spear or dart with much greater force. This really made it possible to hunt even the biggest animals. And then they also had these finely crafted stone-cutting blades and scrapers. Those were essential for butchering the animals and preparing the hides for clothing and shelter. They even had these very carefully made needles from antler or ivory, and they used sinew thread to sew warm clothing from hides to protect themselves from the colder climate.
They were resourceful.
They were. And they built temporary shelters, two simple lean-tos or even more substantial hide-covered tents. It's remarkable they even had domesticated dogs, which helped them carry their belongings as they moved across this vast landscape.
I'm just amazed by how resourceful they were in such a different world, really. I'm wondering, what kind of archaeological evidence have we found that helps us understand this period in Arkansas specifically?
Well, we have those big kill sites in other regions like Domembo in Oklahoma and Kimswick in Missouri, and those have given us a lot of information. They found Clovis points right there with the remains of mammoths, mastodons, and other animals. So those sites give us a pretty clear picture of how they hunted and the specific animals they were relying on. But in Arkansas itself, confirmed Paleo-Indian hunting camps or campsites, they're surprisingly rare, although people have found isolated artifacts from this period across the state.
So they're out there.
They're out there. But this relative lack of Clovis materials, it probably means that the initial population in Arkansas was pretty small, maybe only 100 to 150 people, scattered around in small groups. And the biggest concentration of these finds is actually in eastern Arkansas, which makes sense if you think about it. It supports the idea that the first groups migrated south, following the Mississippi River down from the northern plains.
Yeah, the river would have been a natural highway for them.
Yeah.
Makes total sense. What about their social lives, their beliefs? Have archaeologists found anything that might tell us about that from this early period?
That's where things get a little tricky, because those parts of culture, those intangible parts, they don't always leave clear traces behind. But there's one interesting pattern that we see. They consistently used non-local materials for their stone tools. Even when there was perfectly good stone nearby, they often chose materials from far away. One explanation for this is that it was actually a survival strategy, a way to share information and keep those vital connections between those small, scattered groups. Those journeys to get these special, high-quality materials, well, they could have been chances to communicate, sharing knowledge about where to find resources, possible dangers, and just strengthening their social bonds.
So it's possible that needing a particular type of stone, it wasn't just about making a better tool. There could have been a social purpose behind it, too. That's a really interesting way to think about it.
Yeah.
What about their spiritual beliefs? Any clues about that?
As you might guess, the evidence here is even more subtle. But we know from modern hunter-gatherer societies that their religious beliefs are often closely tied to the natural world and how they get their food. And there's this one really fascinating piece of evidence from the Cooper site in Oklahoma, not far from Arkansas. They found a bison skull with a red zigzag line painted on it. The pigment was hematite, a mineral that was often used in rituals by ancient hunter societies. This hints that the Paleo-Indians in the Mid-South, they might have also seen the hunt as something sacred, maybe a kind of interaction or even a social contract with the spirit world.
So moving forward in time, the Ice Age eventually comes to an end, and we enter a new period, around 8500 BC, the Dalton period.
Right.
What were the big changes that mark this new era?
The most important change, the one that really defines the shift to the Dalton period, was the extinction of the Ice Age megafauna. It happened around 8500 BC, and this had a huge impact on their way of life. They had to adapt, start hunting deer, elk, and these smaller, modern bison. And these animals, they were different, they behaved differently. The Paleo-Indians had to come up with new hunting strategies.
So a new set of challenges, new solutions needed. Did they develop a distinct culture during this period?
Yes, they did. The Dalton culture emerged, and it's characterized by a new type of projectile point called the Dalton point. But the way they made these points, the techniques, show a link back to the Paleo-Indian tradition, so there's a clear cultural connection there.
Yeah.
We also see more Dalton sites in Arkansas, and they're more spread out. This points to a growing population, maybe over 500 people by this point.
And it sounds like they were moving around less, becoming less nomadic.
That's right. The Dalton people, they started to settle down a bit more. They started to create what we think were multi-season base camps, places they would occupy for longer periods, maybe even years.
Wow.
Yeah, and from these base camps, they would go out to hunt, fish, gather plants, and get the stone they needed to make tools. We also start to see woodworking tools appear like adges and celts, which tells us they were using wood more and more, probably for building more permanent structures.
It's remarkable how adaptable they were to these big environmental changes. You mentioned a really interesting Dalton site in eastern Arkansas.
Right, the Sloan site. It's on this low sand dune in the Cache River Valley, and it's actually the oldest known cemetery in the Western Hemisphere, dates back to around 8,500 BC.
Wow, a cemetery from that long ago.
Yeah, archaeologists found these clusters of Dalton artifacts. There are lots of Dalton points, other tools, and raw materials. What's really striking is that some of these clusters, they seem to be deliberately aligned, running northeast to southwest, and they've also carefully uncovered these small, very eroded pieces of human bone.
That is an incredible discovery. What does a site like that tell us about the Dalton people? What were their beliefs?
The Sloan site is really a significant moment in human history. It shows us that they were developing a new, deeply meaningful connection to the land, particularly the land that held the remains of their ancestors. The offerings that they seem to have placed in the graves, well, they suggest that they were starting to believe in an afterlife, a continued existence even after death. And this connection to their ancestral remains and to a specific place on the land, that would become a really important, lasting part of later American Indian cultures in the region.
So they're starting to develop a sense of belonging to a place.
Exactly.
Moving on from the Dalton period, we enter this really long period called the Archaic, which spans from about 8,500 BC to 600 BC. This feels like a time of huge change in the region.
It was. The Archaic period, we see just a ton of development driven by changes in the climate and, importantly, by the people themselves. They were actively learning about and modifying their environment. I think the most profound change during this time was the domestication of several native plant species right here in Arkansas and the broader Mid-South.
That's amazing.
Yeah, the archaeological and botanical evidence now really points to this region as a major global center for the origins of agriculture.
I think a lot of people might not realize that Arkansas is a birthplace of agriculture.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. What kinds of plants were they actually domesticating?
Oh, it's a really fascinating list. They had Chenopodium, which is also known as lambsquarters, knotweed, marsh elder, also called sumpweed, maygrass, little barley, sunflower, and then all sorts of gourds and squashes. Over generations, they carefully selected and cultivated these wild plants and gradually transformed them into domesticated crops, plants that gave them more food and were easier to harvest. And this is how gardening began, which likely started between 2500 and 1500 BC. This was a big deal because it gave them more food, allowed the population to grow, and led to even more settled lifestyles.
I guess those plants we might see growing wild today, they have this long history of cultivation, going back to the very first Arkansans. That's incredible.
Yeah.
So they weren't just relying on hunting and gathering anymore. They were actually shaping their food supply. And I imagine that all of that had an impact on the types of technology they were developing too.
It did. During the Archaic period, we start seeing larger chipped and ground stone adzes and axes. These were essential for better woodworking, including things like making dugout canoes, which would have been huge for transportation and fishing.
Yeah, that would have been a game changer.
Right. And they developed these ground stone implements, milling basins, grinding stones, things that were needed to process all those nuts, seeds, and other plant foods. It's interesting when archaeologists excavate these sites, they find tons of carbonized nutshells in their old trash pits. This might mean they were actually managing the hardwood forests in some areas to get more nuts.
So they were becoming sophisticated land managers.
They were. And thanks to the fact that organic materials preserve so well in the Ozark rock shelters, we get a much clearer picture of their daily lives during this time.
What kind of things have been found?
Oh, we found bonefish hooks, harpoon heads, bone and antler needles and awls, which tells us they were making really finely crafted clothing from both animal skins and from really intricate woven plant fibers. There's also marine shell bracelets and necklaces, so they had long-distance trade networks. And they had woven fiber nets and baskets. You can see how they were using native plants for a wide variety of things, not just food.
That's incredible. They really had a whole toolkit for thriving in this environment. How did all of this impact their diet and where they chose to live?
Their settlement patterns. Their food systems became very diverse. They still hunted deer, turkey, and other game that was still important. But plant foods, especially nuts and acorns, became increasingly essential. Hickory nuts, with all that fat content, those were super important. Most archaic communities, they created these more permanent year-round base camps. Often they lived in more substantial circular dwellings, think bent saplings covered in bark or woven mats, usually with a central hearth for warmth and cooking.
Feels cozy.
And these base camps, they would be surrounded by special activity areas for things like hunting, collecting nuts, and making tools. This new way of life, being more settled, having a more varied diet, it all helped their population continue to grow during the Archaic period.
With more people living together in more settled communities, did we start to see any changes in how they organized themselves socially
Yeah.
or how they thought about their own identity?
Yeah, this is a key time for those kinds of social developments. We start to see these regionally distinct styles in the things they made, especially in the shape and decoration of their dart points. Archaeologists see this as a sign that they were developing a stronger sense of community identity. These stylistic differences, they might have served several purposes. Maybe they helped regulate the space between groups, helped them trade, or even just reinforce social interactions as more groups started to live closer together.
It makes sense.
Yeah, and then in the late Archaic, they started using cemeteries more regularly for burials, and some of these cemeteries were used by multiple generations, so that shows an even stronger connection to specific ancestral lands. And then some graves have these more elaborate offerings than others, which could be an early sign that there were status differences within those communities. Like we're starting to see the very beginnings of more complex social structures.
Yeah, it really does seem that way. You mentioned earlier that trade became more important during the Archaic period.
Oh, absolutely. As the communities grew bigger and settled down, trade between different groups increased. We start to see more things from faraway places at their sites, so we know those trade networks became more extensive and more reliable.
And what kinds of things were they trading?
Well, they traded practical things, of course, things they needed if their local resources were scarce, but they also traded special materials that they couldn't find nearby. And then the Archaic period also gives us the very first evidence of monumental construction in the Southeast, which is really exciting.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, the very first ceremonial mounds and earthworks in North America appear around 5000 BC, and the oldest ones we found in southeastern Arkansas, those date back to around 1200 BC. These mounds were often placed in prominent spots in the landscape. They were probably central places for important rituals, places that were considered sacred within their territories.
Wow, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and the most impressive example from the late Archaic is the Poverty Point culture, which started around 2000 BC in what's now Louisiana. They built these huge earthworks at Poverty Point, including this enormous bird-shaped mound and a series of concentric earthen embankments.
Sounds incredible.
It really is. And all of that, it tells us they had a highly organized workforce and a complex social structure.
Did Poverty Point's influence extend into Arkansas?
It did. The influence of Poverty Point and its trade network was huge. It covered the central and lower Mississippi Valley and the Gulf Coastal Plain, so that includes big parts of southeastern Arkansas. And so you find these distinctive artifacts associated with Poverty Point spread out over a very large area. Things like intricately carved stone beads and little figurines. But this whole elaborate cultural complex and its trade network, it eventually declined around 1000 BC, probably because of some major climate changes. But it was an early, if temporary, experiment in cultural complexity, and it definitely involved communities in what's now Arkansas.
So the Archaic period was really a time of major change advancements in technology, the development of food production, these increasingly complex social structures, and even the very first monumental architecture. And next we're going to move into the Woodland era, which spans from about 600 BC to 900 AD. What are the main things that define this period?
The Woodland era kind of builds on a lot of those trends we saw in the Archaic, right? The communities keep growing, become even more permanent, and their reliance on domesticated grains as a staple food source, that continues to increase. And this increased reliance on agriculture, it leads to what archaeologists call a container revolution, the widespread use and production of pottery. Yeah. And then during this period, they also invent the bow and arrow, which was another major leap forward in technology. The bow and arrow quickly replaced the older atlatl for both hunting and warfare. And as gardening became more central to their way of life, we see even more variety and sophistication in their soil working tools, tools made from stone, bone, and shell. And then we see a wider range of decorative and ornamental objects start to appear, not just practical stuff.
Pottery and the bow and arrow, those are huge innovations. They would have had a huge impact on their lives.
Yeah.
What about their artistic expressions during the Woodland period? Did that change?
Rock art, both petroglyphs, which are carvings into rock surfaces, and paintographs, which are paintings on rock, becomes more common during the Woodland period. These images often show people all kinds of animals, birds, insects, and then all these geometric and abstract forms. And interesting, these rock art motifs, they often match the designs you find on portable artifacts from the same time, things like pottery and bone tools.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and it's possible that earlier groups were creating rock art too, but we have way more examples from the Woodland period, and they're easier to date. It's generally thought that this rock art was tied to rituals, maybe marking boundaries and communicating social and religious ideas. It's like we're getting these direct glimpses into their belief systems and how they understood the world, all through their artistic expression.
It does feel that way. So how did their the ways they got their food, continue to evolve in the woodland period?
They still have that very diverse economy, so hunting, trapping, fishing, gathering wild plants, that was all still happening. But cultivating plants, especially grains and gathering nuts, became even more central to their lives. And then, around the first millennium AD, corn, which had been domesticated in Central America a long time before, was introduced to the Mid-South, and so they gradually integrated it into their existing food systems, corn. And we also see them develop even better food storage technologies to manage their harvest and make sure they had enough to eat. And where they chose to settle during the woodland period, well, that starts to be influenced by the presence of good soil for gardening, like we see at the Durst site up on the Buffalo River in northern Arkansas.
And you mentioned that the pottery itself changed, like, the materials they used.
Right. In the late woodland period, there's a pretty noticeable shift toward using shell-tempered pottery. This means they started adding crushed shell to the clay mix before they fired it.
I see.
And that made the pottery stronger, more resistant to those quick temperature changes, like when you put it over a fire.
Smart.
Yeah. And that might have been because they were boiling dried grains more, which the older grit-tempered pottery wasn't so great for. This change in how they made pottery, it actually led to a greater diversity of vessel shapes in the late woodland, and that continued into the Mississippian period. And then at sites like Durst, we see the houses change too. They start building more substantial houses, square-shaped, often with internal hearths and storage pits. So that reflects a more settled way of life.
So by the middle of the woodland period, their trade networks were pretty extensive across the eastern woodlands for practical stuff and ceremonial goods, I imagine.
Yes, definitely. Their networks for getting things like obsidian and copper and even finished ceremonial objects stretched over huge distances across eastern North America. During the Middle Woodland, these networks became really closely tied to this widespread ceremonial complex known as the Hopewell culture, which started in the Ohio River Valley around 200 BC. One of the defining characteristics of Hopewell was the elaborate burial of high-status leaders in conical earthen mounds, and often they would bury them with these amazing grave goods made from those non-local materials. We see this Hopewell influence in Arkansas at sites like the Helena Mound site in Phillips County.
And what kind of things did they find at Helena Mound that tell us it was connected to this Hopewell culture?
At Helena Mound, they excavated a series of important burials that were placed inside these huge log tombs, which were then covered over by these large conical mounds. One of the most notable burials was that of a young woman, probably in her teens, and she was buried with this incredible collection of grave goods. They found a pan pipe that was covered in both copper and silver, copper ear spools, a really intricate bead belt made from drilled wolf canines and marine shells, and all sorts of armbands, bracelets, and necklaces made from pearl and conch shell beads.
Wow.
This kind of elaborate burial for someone so young, well, it suggests that she must have been born into a high-ranking family. It shows us that these communities were developing these social hierarchies as they adopted more of those Hopewellian traditions.
So we're seeing the development of more complex, socially stratified societies. And this seems to continue in the late woodland period with the Plum Bayou culture and the Toltec Mound site.
Exactly. The Toltec Mounds site near Scott, Arkansas, it was built by the people of the Plum Bayou culture, and it has at least 18 earthen mounds, including this new type, large, flat-topped, pyramidal platform mounds. These mounds were meant to have structures built on top of them, not just to cover burials like a lot of earlier mounds did.
I see.
And these platform mounds, groups like the Natchez, were still using them into historic times for their temples and mortuary houses. They became these lasting, powerful symbols of the social hierarchies that were developing in many southeastern Indian communities.
I'm curious about those astronomical alignments at Toltec. Those are fascinating.
Yeah, what's really cool about Toltec is that they intentionally aligned several of the mounds so they could act as an astronomical observatory, a way to track the movements of the sun, particularly during the solstices and equinoxes.
That's incredible. An astronomical observatory built entirely out of Earth. I mean, what would have been the purpose behind these alignments?
Well, one of the main theories is that communities like the Plum Bayou people, they gained social prestige and authority by connecting their rituals and social order to the predictable cycles of the cosmos. They often associated these celestial events with powerful spirits and cosmological forces in their belief systems.
So they're demonstrating their knowledge and understanding of the cosmos.
Right. Sites like Toltec, they really showed off the organizational power of these societies and their ability to connect their community to these, I guess you could say, transcendental forces. And this tradition of aligning mounds astronomically, which becomes even more common in both the woodland and Mississippian periods well, it really evolved into those platform mound traditions we see later on.
It's amazing.
It is. It's likely that their leaders used this perceived connection to the spirit world to strengthen their authority, gaining respect and loyalty by leading the construction of these really impressive public works.
So that brings us to the last major prehistoric period we'll be discussing today, the Mississippian era, which goes from about 900 AD to 1541 AD, basically up to when Hernando de Soto's expedition arrived. What were the big changes and developments during this time?
The Mississippian era is marked by a few key things: a big jump in population, the widespread adoption of large-scale, intensive agriculture, and the emergence of large, densely populated communities. Some of them probably had thousands of residents.
Thousands.
Thousands. By this time, Arkansas had tens of thousands of people living in communities spread across the whole state. We see even more advancements in technology. They had larger and more specialized tools for farming made from stone, shell, and even bison shoulder blades. They were doing a lot more woodworking for fuel, construction, and clearing land for farming. Intensive agriculture was booming in the fertile bottomlands of the Mississippi Valley. Some communities were cultivating vast fields.
The agriculture was really taking off.
It was. Pottery production became more specialized, too. They were making elaborately decorated vessels for trade and ceremonies. And we see just an explosion of artistic expression in all sorts of mediums. And there were these regional stylistic differences, which probably reflected different social identities, status differences, and complex religious symbolism.
It sounds like a really sophisticated and complex society. What was the key to their agricultural success? How are they able to support so many people?
Well, they shifted away from having those diverse mixed economies and focused more on the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. This trio of crops, it gave them a really balanced and nutritious diet.
Yeah, the Three Sisters.
The three sisters, exactly. And in the Mississippi Valley, this intense focus on agriculture, it sometimes led to more competition for the best land, even violent conflict between groups. And so they started building fortified towns for protection, like Nodina and Parkin in northeast Arkansas.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And beyond the changes in agriculture, did you know they also had specialized occupations and these vast trade networks that spanned huge distances?
Oh, that's right. Tell me more about that.
So we see the development of specialized jobs. Certain communities would focus on producing extra goods for trade. Like, for example, the Caddo Indians in southwest Arkansas. They became known for making salt, which was a really valuable resource.
I see.
And leaders in these Mississippian societies, they often controlled these large trade networks and, to some extent, the distribution of wealth. This included practical goods, but also prestige items that signaled your rank and status in society. And this control over resources and trade, well, it contributed to a hierarchy of settlements, with powerful leaders usually living in those bigger temple mound centers.
You mentioned Nodian and Parkin as examples of Mississippian communities in northeast Arkansas.
Yeah.
What were those towns like? How were they laid out?
Nodina and Parkin, they were big, fortified agricultural towns located right in the middle of the rich farmland of northeast Arkansas. They had several platform mounds, which were used as raised platforms for the homes of important leaders, shrines, and temples. They also had open plazas for public ceremonies and gatherings. These towns, they had large populations, hundreds, maybe even thousands of people.
That's incredible.
And they had big grain storage facilities, which tells us there was some centralized control over food resources. It's interesting, though, the burial practices at these sites, they don't really show a lot of signs of strong social ranking. So that raises some questions about how power worked in these particular Mississippian societies.
And then the Caddo people in southwest Arkansas, they seem to have had a different pattern of settlement and social organization.
Yeah, the Caddo, their settlements were more spread out family farmsteads clustered around individual temple mound sites. And unlike Nodina and Parkin, they typically didn't have fortifications or big community fields. Their houses were often circular with grass-thatched roofs. And while Caddo leaders did have authority over neighboring communities, it seems like they didn't directly control the economic resources that individual families produced.
So it was more decentralized.
Right. Individual households, they managed their own farming and contributed to the support of their leaders. And the Caddo also had a high-status warrior class, which might be why they didn't need as many fortifications.
So both of these groups, they had these really elaborate burial practices, which seems to point to a focus on the afterlife and their ancestors.
Absolutely. Mississippian mortuary practices were often very detailed and served several purposes. They were about honoring the dead, of course, but also about affirming or even reorganizing the social and political relationships among the living. A great example of this is what's called the Great Mortuary at the Spiro site in eastern Oklahoma. It's right near the western border of Arkansas. At Spiro, they found the reburials of dozens of people, and they were buried with this amazing array of offerings.
What kind of offerings?
Oh, they found tons of shell beads, these incredibly detailed copper plates, beautifully carved conch shell cups, pottery, weapons, even stone statues. And researchers have interpreted this arrangement of burials and offerings as a kind of cosmogram, a visual representation of how the world of the living and the world of the dead were connected. The idea being that ancestral spirits were still an important part of the community's spiritual life.
So these weren't just burials, they were statements about their beliefs and how they saw the universe.
Exactly. And that incredible art from Spiro, a lot of those funerary items, they're decorated with these specific symbols and motifs that are characteristic of what we call the Southeastern ceremonial complex.
That's right, the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex.
Right. This was a big religious and ceremonial movement, and it seems to have started at Cahokia, this large Mississippian center near what's now St. Louis. It started around the 10th and 11th centuries AD, and its influence, especially the artistic style, spread across a huge area of the Southeast. And the art associated with this complex, it uses these prominent symbols like amphibians, snakes, spiders. Those are usually associated with the below world in their cosmology. Then there are birds representing the above world, and these composite creatures like the winged serpent, which symbolizes the connection between those different realms. And then they also have images of dancers in really elaborate regalia, which suggests that they had important rituals for connecting with and harnessing these sacred forces. It's really incredible art, and it gives us this amazing insight into the religious beliefs and practices of the Mississippian societies.
It's really fascinating how these beliefs and styles spread across such a large area.
It is.
You mentioned earlier that not every part of Arkansas was well suited for that kind of intensive agriculture you see in the main Mississippian centers. What were those communities like?
You're right, in the Ozarks and the Wakitas, and even in some parts of the lower Mississippi Valley where large-scale farming wasn't so easy, many communities continued to rely on a mix of strategies during the Mississippian era: hunting, gathering wild foods, and smaller-scale gardening. But it's important to remember that these groups weren't isolated. They still had connections, economic, social, and ceremonial, with those agricultural societies in the river valleys.
I see.
For example, in the western Ozarks, we find these local mound centers that are clearly connected to the Spiroan.